So where to start? Well, I'm going to start by saying a little bit about where resilience fits into the work of the Ulex project. And I'll do that by sharing with you a framework that we use for designing our program. You know, mostly what we do is we run trainings helping to build capacity within social movements. So what's that mean? Well, look, here's a diagram. I think might give us a way into that. I'll share this with you on my screen. So hopefully you can see that. Maybe someone give me a thumbs up or something if you can. Yeah, great. Thanks, Gita. Thanks. Well, thanks everyone. So okay, so here we go. This slide shows how we think about capacity building for social movements. Basically, we use a framework thinking about what are some of the key capabilities that social movements need in order to be effective. So we work with 5 of these. The first one here is narrative. So a narrative capability, the ability for our movements to sort of tell the story of what's going on. You know, how did we get here? The story, the vision, as it were, of like, where could we go to? How could things be different? What would need to happen for those changes to happen? And importantly as well, in this sort of narrative capability is the idea of like, who are we? You know, and building movements, a really important part of this is the kind of the building a sense of the we that constitute those movements. So the narrative capability. Second capability is the disruptive capacity or capability, which is, you know, you could think about this as maybe one of the obvious forms of all the different kinds of civil disobedience that movements might be involved in, but lots of other things as well. It's the ways that our movements help to open up space for change. It's the ways that we build increase our leverage in the situation. It's ways in which we sort of say no to the sort of the day-to-day functioning of the status quo of the system that we're in. So disruptive capability. The third one is an institutional capability, which is so important as a way of translating our stories and leveraging disruption to make real structural change. I think one way of getting a sense of this is if you think back maybe to something like one recent historical example might be the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement had a disruptive capability, you know, the occupying of spaces, you know, generating a lot of attention through that kind of stuff. And it had a very strong narrative capability. One of the most important legacies of Occupy was this stuff about, you know, the 1% and the 99%, you know, a really easy way to kind of like bring clarity to the levels of inequality within our society. So really strong in that sense, but really lacked a capacity to translate that into institutional change. Although, you know, historically we might say that maybe that's something that's happening now, other people pick that up. And thinking about these capabilities is very useful in recognizing the different kinds of roles that there are within our movements. You know, some parts of our movements do narrative and disruption very well. Other parts of our movements are needed for this institutional kind of transformation. So institutional capability, changing structures, implementing vision, transforming power relationships. These 3 are you know, often sort of referred to. I first came across them in a book by an activist called Zaremba, and the book is called Twitter and Tear Gas. And she had done a lot of research looking at the phenomenon of the Arab Spring, the kind of uprising in Turkey as well. And so these 3 are kind of quite common. The next 2 are the ones that at Ulex we add to that as well, which aren't often given as much attention. So the 4th one is prefigurative capability. I mean, prefigurative is a sort of a fancy term for walking the talk. Right? It's about how do we, within our movements, embody our values? How do we model the kind of new social relations that we're struggling to produce in the world? You know, it's not just about creating that in the future, but how do we do it now? How do we embody that within the way that we struggle together? So prefigurative capability. And then the 5th one, resilience. You know, it's like, if we're a threat, we are going to be under attack. Right? You know, we're going to be attacked by the state, we're going to be attacked by non-state actors. Actually, the way the system is set up, in a certain sense, attacks many of us in different ways. It's just, you know, it's basically structured in a way that it suppresses and represses our capacity to change things. So resilience is key in weathering repression and suppression. It's like we need it to kind of keep going, to avoid, you know, to deal with the burnout and the disillusionment and the cynicism that can arise in long-term struggles where we kind of hemorrhage talent. And it's also part of the nourishing our roots. You know, how do we stay nourished? How do we do that? So this area of resilience. So focusing on that, here's another slide for you. Here we go. This is one of the ways we think about building resilience in movement. So we talk about strategies for psychosocial resilience. And the term psychosocial is supposed to kind of emphasize that this isn't just about like individual qualities, it's also about communities, it's also about organizations. And we are quite sort of clear in trying to bring attention to 3 dimensions of resilience, psychosocial resilience. So the individual and the personal, you know, what goes on in our emotional lives, what happens within our own mental states, what happens with our own health and our well-being, and there are strategies at that level. As individuals in our struggles, we operate within organizations, within groups, and so we need to build strategies for resilience within our groups, within our organizations. This is like the interpersonal dimension. And our organizations and groups, they sit within a bigger ecology of our movements, you know, so the socio-political movement dimension of resilience. How do we navigate the relationships across our movements? How do we build relationships and connections between different parts of our movements that support resilience? Okay, I'm going to drop the screen, I think, now. Okay, so today the idea is we're going to talk with 5 people, right, who do really interesting work in areas related to the intersection of these different dimensions of psychosocial resilience. You know, the inner and the outer, the psychological and the political and the ecological, and see, you know, what we can learn through this kind of conversation. And I'm going to start by chatting with Anthea, and Anthea has a background in quite a long sort of career engagement in activism of different sorts, a lot of human rights work, working with organisations like Amnesty, Global Witness, arms trade work and so on, and in recent years took a bit of a step back from that to reflect more deeply on questions about how does the inner inform our outer engagement and so on. So Anthea, hello, and I'm going to kind of ask you a little bit about the journey that took you to this pause, this kind of period of stepping back that you've been sort of engaged in recently. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, and thanks for inviting me along. Yes, so about 4 years ago, I stepped back from the form of activism that I had been doing. I originally trained as a journalist. I was a newspaper reporter. I thought I was going to change the world that way. I soon realised that wasn't quite going to work out as I'd imagined. And I moved into working for NGOs. I spent 5 years working for controls on the arms trade. I worked on the campaign that Oxfam and Amnesty did for the arms trade treaty. When I was working at Amnesty, I worked for an organisation, a coalition of 700 gun control organisations around the world, trying to persuade the UN to control the small arms trade. And then I moved to working on economic justice issues, specifically the resource curse, the tendency of countries which are very wealthy in natural resources, let's assuming we're framing them like that just for a moment, like oil and diamonds and timber, to end up with very high levels of conflict and poverty. And so I started up campaigns looking at the role of banks and tax havens in creating poverty, effectively, by facilitating corruption and massive transfers of wealth from these countries straight into the City of London and other financial centres. And I did this for a long time, and some of it was successful. We didn't have much of a go at the banks. They're still accepting corrupt money. But helped start up a campaign that noticed the way that people could hide corrupt money by setting up companies and hiding their ownership of them. So we launched a campaign saying, if you set up a company, you've got to say who it is. And it all just took off. It really took off. Lots of other organisations joined in. Somehow we managed to persuade several governments, and now 79 countries at the latest count have done it. So that should have been successful, and I should have been feeling quite good, and of course I was. But I was also feeling like I was running into a wall. And there were several feelings in that. One was this pervasive sense that in many ways we were replicating aspects of the system that we were trying to change. We were operating according to various rational actor assumptions that of course underpin the economics we were trying to influence. We weren't treating everybody brilliantly within the organisations that we were working in. I was also having this very strong realisation that was coming from spending my weekends climbing mountains and jumping in rivers and trying to sort of balance up the stress of what I was doing with some greenery. I was realising the depth of our connection with the non-human world and becoming really troubled by the fact that even if I fulfilled every single detail on these incredibly detailed log frames that we had to fill out for our funders, saying exactly what we were going to do and exactly what our objectives were and exactly how we were going to show we had done it. I could do all of that, and we still would be doing ourselves out of a planet that we can live on. And that dissonance just became too great. I was also becoming tired of the demonizing, tired of the extent to which we were chasing these people and saying, yes, you're the problem. This is what we need to. This is what you need to do. And of course, yes, what they were doing was a problem. But there was something in the way that I was doing it that became very troubling. And so I stepped back from what I was doing, and there were personal reasons for that as well. And I started thinking about this question of what the inner life of activism, because it felt like something was missing. It felt like we were so busy being practical and strategic and tactical about the practical details of what needed changing, that we were missing something. And so I embarked with an organisation I'm working with at the moment called Perspectiva, which is quite new and has been set up to look at the links between our inner worlds and the outer world. I embarked on a fairly ill-defined inquiry into the inner life of activism. And I didn't try and define it myself. I just wanted, I suppose to start with, I wanted to know if I was going mad. Am I the only person thinking this? What's going on here? And I started talking to other activists, and I wasn't going mad. I found lots of people who, from very different perspectives, were sort of saying the same thing. And so slowly, that has turned into a book called The Entangled Activist, which I've almost finished.
Yeah, so I mean, I was lucky enough to see sort of a sneak preview of your latest draft of the book, which looks really fascinating, right? The Entangled Activist. What are the sort of some of the key themes that you're kind of addressing there? What are you wanting to really share with people?
Well, ultimately, that it's time. Well, it's time to. It's always been time, but it's about recognising the extent and the depth to which we are part of what we're trying to change. Now, there's this casual expression that gets used when you start being a campaigner and people say, oh, you're off to change the world. That was the sort of thing my mum would say to me. And, you know, okay, this is trite and it's silly in a way, but I think that the grammar of that sentence is very interesting and it reveals something extremely deep about the way that the world, as we perceive it, is over there and we are over here and we're going to do something about it over there. Now, that sounds a bit abstract, doesn't it? So a specific example is some of my colleagues and I, not everyone, we would talk about getting the bastards. Now that's a framing that really says you're over there. And yes, okay, sometimes they arguably were. We're talking about offshore tax lawyers and kleptocrats, bagmen and bankers and oil company executives and all these people who are doing these things that we were publishing reports about. But I've thought about that a lot since I've been thinking about it. Now, what shifts if we do acknowledge that we're part of what we're trying to change? I think something shifts in how we go about doing activism. And I think something also potentially shifts in what it is we see needs doing in the world. So on the how, if we acknowledge that the problems run through us and that they're as much in us as anyone else, then we're less likely to do that polarising it's you over there thing. I think it changes how we engage. It raises the possibility of having more effective conversations. And in situations where conversations are not going to be happening and we're resisting, then I think it can help us find the love and the compassion that are the necessary counterweight to anger and commitment in coming together to form non-violent resistance. And of course, the nature of how the problems run through us depends on where we're starting from. There are differences between being involved in campaigning with lived experience of an issue and being involved in campaigning because you can see there's a problem and you'd really want to help. And of course, there's no simple binary on that either, because we're all affected in different ways. Another how that comes up is how we're operating in our organisations. And you've just referred to this, G, this question of prefiguration. Now, if we recognise that cultures of relentless doing and action and activity, if they run through us as well as the endless growth economy that we're trying to do something about, then we can start to understand the deep roots of burnout a bit more. If we recognise that the habits of dominance that we criticise in the people we want to change also run very deep in us, then we can start to see how we can end up enacting them even without realising, with other campaigners we're working with, and perhaps particularly with the people that we're trying to help. And if we recognise that the dominant culture of individualism that we're in centres us as the subject and everyone else, everything else as the object, and this thinking goes hundreds of years deep in the thinking of modernity, then it starts to show us how we can become attached to ideas of progress that have us at the centre of them as the person making it happen. And if we're in that place, then it's very hard to do the thing that makes activism more sustainable, which is seeing it as a practice, something that we do even if we're not getting results, and we can just keep at it. And if we can see the extent of this problem running through us, our sense of what it is that needs to change broadens. Of course the policies and the rules need fixing, of course they do, but we start to see that the root of bad policies and bad politics is in how humans relate to each other. And on this basis, altering our perception to recognise our interconnectedness with everyone and everything else can become quite a radical move. And of course, it's not new to be saying any of this. People have been saying this forever. But goodness, it keeps coming up. It comes up with every generation of activists. So what I'm trying to do in this book is reflect on the practical examples from my own experience, but in the light of what I've realised since taking a temporary breather from it, about the extent to which we're entangled.
Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing the book in its sort of final form. Having had that sneak preview, because it covers stuff at Ulex we've been exploring for some years, and in that process, activists need to find the space to step back, need to find the opportunities for deeper reflection, to recognise, as you say, the way that we reproduce the problems in the way that we do our activism and so on. One of the risks that we've seen in that is this risk of kind of pathologising our activism in that process, a bit like it hurts, right? When we recognise how we're doing that in our own lives, it kind of hurts. And I think sometimes people get burnt by that and almost then kind of react against their activism and sort of pathologise it. Do you see that as a risk? And how do we avoid that if we can?
I think it is a risk, and this is really important, isn't it? Because we're getting so much criticism from outside already. I think this is one of the reasons that I paused for so long before doing this, because I'd thought about it for a long time. I'd see these problems in activism and think, well, we can't say anything. It feels somehow disloyal to me. And why would we give our opponents ammunition? Why would we give them yet another opportunity to bypass the content of what we're saying and agree with us that we think we're being a bit annoying? Because, what is it that I went out and asked people, what is it that is difficult about activists? And the same words kept coming up: righteous, hypocritical, shouty, totalitarian is the worst of it from people on the conservative side who worry about that. And when these accusations are being made about our psychology, it can feel, I think, like a political failure to pay attention to the same material. And of course, it's true. It's not just about our psychology. But I think we can approach this without saying it's just about our psychology and we're going to go down this route of saying everything we're doing is terrible, and also avoiding the extreme of saying, well, we just need to stick with the political and the material explanations of what's going on. because to be resistant to looking at our inner lives, I think is to reinforce once again this duality, this binary opposition that the dominant culture sets up between the inner and the outer. I think it's possible to look at our inner lives together with looking at power, and it can be a means of resisting power, not submitting to it, to look at how it runs through us and can make us its agent. It might make us better activists.
And in doing that, is there something that we can do that helps us not to, I suppose, kind of, reproduce very sort of self-referential, self-preoccupied, self-absorbed ways of kind of practice, which seem quite real pitfalls of kind of spiritual and therapeutic and psychological work? How might we avoid that? Because I think as activists, people often feel a resistance to doing that inner work because they think they might, just be drawn back into that kind of extreme in a way. Right,
and it is a risk, and we see it happening. I mean, that's the great criticism of the great flowering that happened in the 60s, isn't it? That, they all went off to Esalen and then didn't come back to get on with the work. And this is an entanglement in the individualism that helps to frame us. And they can seem separate poles, but again, this is about the way that our culture presents them as separate. I think it is possible to look at the inner without making it instrumental that we're only doing it in order to improve our activism. But actually, if we can try and hold them both, it can make our activism better. And also, it goes the other way. If we're doing activism in a more aware way, in a more conscious way, I'm nervous about using that word, but with a bit of awareness of what's going on, it can provide data and information that we can feed back into the work that we're doing in our inner lives. And I learned something interesting from working with Sophie Banks, who set up the inner transition component of the transition network. And she sees this in a sort of systems thinking way, which is that there's a feedback loop. And so if we recognise that what is going on within us is a reflection of what's going on in the outside world, then noticing the unhealthy cultures that we can sometimes generate in activism, or the unhealthy patterns that we can get to in ourselves, is a feedback loop of seeing what's going on. It can help us point in the right direction for where our work's going, and how we're doing out there in the world and what the task is in the world.
Yeah. So we'll get to hear a bit more from you when we come back round to these questions and things. When's the book going to be out, by the way, and where are we going to get to see this thing?
So it's being published by a new small press called Perspectiva Press, and I don't know how long it's going to take because I don't know what finishing a book in lockdown involves. And my editor has it at the moment. So let's say this year. And I'm sorry I can't give any more detail.
Great. Cool. Okay, thanks. So gonna sort of turn to have a sort of bring Dean and Aesha into the conversation. And I mean, I was really excited to meet both of you recently, just through Zoom, right? But it was like really brilliant because we've been, as I said, with Ulex sort of working on this sort of interface of inner and outer type work, etc., and using mindfulness as well. We run a training called Mindfulness for Social Change. And I think talking with the two of you, I'm not sure I'd found anybody who kind of was articulating the stuff you're articulating as well as you are. And you kind of at one point said something like, what we're doing with our work is we're trying to help people to become courageous individuals who can be able to bring awareness to all areas of their experience and sort of mental states, their emotional lives, the interpersonal and the socio-political, something like that, right? Forgive me if I'm misquoting you, right? But yeah, I mean, it's like really, I just think it's really exciting, like a really brilliant project, the Urban Mindfulness Foundation. And the other, one of the things you do is something you call mindfulness-based inclusion training. What's that all about? I mean, give us a flavour. Yeah.
Hey, thanks, G. It's that's a big question, but I guess our journey really starts, or certainly my journey starts from being an environmental scientist, and maybe even before that, I should say, growing up in East London, real area of deprivation. I don't know if any of you know, but a sort of borough called Hackney, which was, sort of 40 years ago was a tough place to grow up in. So, my journey really started with a real discontent with my environment, and seeing the environment that I came from, and what, how the environment was perpetuating some of the problems that I was seeing. So I sort of developed a bit of a bee in my bonnet about, the urban environment and sort of creating green spaces. At the time, that was my thing, was to create green spaces. And yeah, so I went through the educational system, did my first degree in that, and really found that actually, whilst I became a relatively successful environmental consultant, there was not much changing for the places that I was really concerned about. So there was a bit of, I guess maybe a lack of hope, really, that things could change. So, but I was coming from a space of very, person-centered, the environment out there, didn't really look at what was going on in here, actually. And, I think it was about 2000 and maybe 8, 9, I started to realize and look into self. What's going on here? Because I couldn't change the world. I realized that I felt like I felt like I couldn't. I felt like I had no agency. So I really started to look into oneself through the sort of window of mindfulness training and practice. And what I found there actually was more self stuff, more looking at building resilience in the self, building a sense of groundedness and stability within self. And then even down the spiritual route, it was a lot about self-liberation, the scary word of things like enlightenment and all that stuff. And like, whoa, my issue was like, or my view was, there was more to this than me, more than this to this than what was just going on here. So as we embarked on all these formal training sessions and so forth, it just didn't sit right. So we just started to question, and we started right at the beginning as, what are we doing here? What is mindfulness? And it took us to study at MSc level, and we realized, there's hundreds of definitions of what mindfulness is. So we really looked at focusing on, what is it we're doing? What is this about? And I think, sort of taking in the previous speaker, we really realized that this was about relational, So we developed a program which was mindfulness-based inclusion. One of the things that we suffered with or struggled with was talking about our social and systemic problems in a mindfulness classroom. And it was like, oh, well, that's your stuff, maybe if you practice a little bit more, you'll get over those stuff, that sort of systemic social thing. And it just wasn't washing. And actually, we practiced a lot with ourselves and on ourselves. Resilience. But then it was clear that again wasn't enough, because
Hey, we're just writing and trying to connect with Dean and Aesha now to see if we can get a stronger connection. Please just bear with us for a second.
we seem to have got cut off. Sorry. Are we back? Can you hear us?
You are back. Yeah, I thought it was me, but it wasn't. Yeah, you are back. Cool.
Great stuff. So, I think in the end, where we came to is that there's more to to this than self-liberation. You know, there's more to this, and there's no point in being well in ourselves and walking past fellow, you know, our fellow kin, and they're really struggling, and they're getting hit by social and systemic issues. So I think what I was actually saying was, people talk about increasing this glass so you can hold the stresses and strains of life more. And I kept saying to my teachers, you know, what happens when you've got a real big vase, you can hold all the stress, but then outside you just keep getting knocked. You know, people keep pulling you down a rabbit hole of, you know, and my particular issue was identity. You know, I've struggled a lot with racism and have had racial attacks and so forth. And I'm like, oh, this is not good enough. You know, there's more to our mindfulness practice than self-liberation. So that's where it really started, I think.
And that sort of brought you to kind of like using a kind of your own sort of definition of mindfulness. The way you mentioned there are lots, and you've got a particular way of defining that, right, in the work you do.
Yeah, we have. And I mean, what we say is, for us, mindfulness is about knowing how you're relating whilst you're relating to everyone and everything. And what that does is really bring us into a space where whatever we're doing, whatever we're connecting, whoever we're connecting with, whether we're at work, in interpersonal, even when we're looking into ourselves, how are we relating to ourselves? How are we relating to others? The systems that we swim in, or, you know, so that's really the definition. How are we relating whilst we're relating to everyone and everything? And that really brings in that compassion side of the practice for us. It really brings in the heart of the practice. And what we found was that, you know, particularly with the medicalized versions of mindfulness, it was like, you know, let's not go down the compassion route. Let's avoid that conversation about the social and systemic issues. Just focus on the breath and you'll be okay, you know. And that was a real problem, I guess. So coming up with that definition, making it relational was key.
Because there's the compassion side to that, but there's also, I mean, the other thing that I think you said to me the other day, Aesha, I think it was, you were saying that your work combines this idea of wise attention, which you get in mindfulness, with critical thinking. And I guess when we start bringing awareness to a relationship in a way, it involves a certain kind of critical approach to understand and unpick what's really going on in these relationships. And with that, you also were saying something about problematizing in mindfulness this idea of non-judgment and acceptance. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, like Dean mentioned, there's so many different definitions of mindfulness, but a lot of them they touch around, you know, avoiding judgment or avoiding preference. As human beings, I don't know if anyone else out there can relate, but we tend to do that. We tend to judge. We tend to have a preference. You know, that's part of our agency. It's a part of, you know, noticing if there's an issue. It's a part of our survival. So this idea of looking at, you know, what are we judging? What is our preference? Where does it come from? So we start to be interested. We start to be curious. And this is how we can be more connected. When there's a sense of judgment and preference, there's also a telling that we either are separating or we are connecting. And it's about noticing those boundaries. You know, there's a teacher out there called Tara Brach. Some of you may know of her. She's an excellent mindfulness teacher. And she says the boundaries to what we're willing to, what we are unwilling to accept are the boundaries to our freedom. Now that in itself is massive. So it's about looking at acceptance and also noticing there is a slight difference there with judgment, preference. Accepting doesn't actually mean that we have to necessarily approve. We can accept that things are happening, accept that, you know, there's difficulties in the world, but we don't have to approve them. So we can start to be curious about what's happening. A lot of mindfulness, you know, we go into practice, we're meditating, there's a sense of we've got something wrong if we're thinking. Actually, that's what we do. but start to be curious. Where does the mind go? If we're ruminating and we get stuck on thoughts, where is the mind taking us? Not that we have to engage it, not that we have to approve it, but actually accept that this is part of us, our being as a human being, and start to look into that. Start to see what we're thinking about and be critical about it. You know, where does the mind go? What is it telling us? Is it true? Is it real? So we start to really be interested in our own existence. And this is where the wise attention comes in. You know, when we're looking at wise discernment, how we move through into the world, into bringing mindfulness into our everyday living, how we are, we've got to have some kind of wise discernment, not just going with things, you know, willy-nilly. A lot of mindfulness training is about working with emotional intelligence, but we can also have cultural intelligence. We can also have social intelligence. How are we as people? You know, Anthea mentioned earlier about this sense of, you know, othering. That's a massive part of what we do. If we're, as people, as beings, we are constantly trying to survive, and what we don't really acknowledge so much is how much anxiety we have around other people, especially if there's a sense of difference. But if we are in a real knowing that we all struggle, we all suffer somehow, a lot of it is related to our identity and also our ideas. But when we get a sense of distance or separation, it's about being curious about that. Where does it come from? A lot of it is to do with our social conditioning. A lot of it is to do with our socialization. You know, what's fed into us, the systems that we live in, the institutions that we're surrounded by. So we start to be really curious about, you know, what we consume, you know, where we learn, how we've grown, those kind of things, and what we continue to do. Do we perpetuate suffering unknowingly? When we get a sense of difference in space, what is that? What's going on there? Can we get a real sense of connection? So for us, mindfulness is really about looking at where we are excluding and seeing if we can include. You know, really start to look at where our own boundaries are, so that we can be more in a space of we. You know, we all have different ideas. We all ultimately want to be happy. Some ideas might be a bit warped, but, you know, that's just human nature. That's human nature.
Yeah. And so how do you, I mean, like with the mindfulness-based inclusion training, how do you inquire into this stuff with people? What sort of process does that involve?
It's a really interesting question, because what we realized is that, you know, for those of you who do practice mindfulness, there's a typical triangle, you know, and they talk about thoughts, feelings, or emotions and bodily sensations. And, you know, what we found was that is as far as the inquiry tends to go. And when it gets sort of people go into storytelling or explaining about their life, I'll come back to, you know, the present. How does the body feel now? So it's a avoidance tactic, really, to go into the real deeper conversation. So we have a number of layers underneath that original sort of triangle, where we look at habitual patterns as a first step. Then underneath our habitual patterns, we look at conditioning. So we really go into quite a bit of our social conditioning. How do we come to know, you know? And then we look at our relationships, attitudes, and then how that manifests into behavior. So anytime we have an inquiry and you know, someone comes up with an experience, we'll ask, okay, so is there any habit there? Where might that come from? How do we come to know? So we really look at the epistemological questions. How do we come to know anything? You know, what is it we know or we truly believe in? And then normally what we can find is, when we look into that with critical thinking, we observe that it's through our socialization, it's through our education, it's through our culture that formulates these real certainties. You know, and then we invite a sense of practice that allows us to be comfortable in a place of uncertainty, which is also a place of creativity, you know. So really it's about creating, I think, going through these levels of inquiry, habitual patterns, conditioning, attitudes, relationship, and behavior, as well as the triangle. And that really opens up the we. That really opens up how much of what we know is not really our own, of our own origination. It's really a cultural ramshackle. One of our teachers says we're a ramshackle of habitual thoughts, patterns, and conditioning. And it's a ramshackle of that, really, that comes to the fore. And then when we realize that, we can open up to others. So that's how we come to know. That's how we come to understand. And then we can be more curious about others. How do you know? And then, the rest sort of does itself, really. I think it opens us up to listening deeply to others that we perhaps wouldn't normally listen to.
And where people can kind of get a feel for this, I guess, is it in the trainings you're doing? Is it mostly in East London that you're doing that kind of work at the moment?
Yeah, so normally we have a drop-in group that goes every 2 weeks. So we meet up every 2 weeks in the local community centre. But obviously during lockdown, we've had to put that on hold for a while. So a lot of our sessions have gone online. So for 8 weeks during lockdown, we were doing daily sessions just to support anyone actually that wanted to connect. It didn't just have to be our local community, but anyone that wanted to connect. We've now cut that back a little bit. So every Wednesday and every Saturday we meet up just for an hour in the morning on a Wednesday between 8 and 9, and then on a Saturday between 10 and 12. So from the morning till lunchtime. But it's grown over time. We've also done some work with the Mindfulness Association, where we've done a few workshops with the MSc students that are actually studying with the University of Aberdeen. So we're stretching some of our research that we've been doing, and more people have become interested. So over time, it depends, whoever's interested, we're kind of happy to collaborate. We're happy to share. We're not kind of this, we're not trying to be a massive commercial enterprise, by no means. We are about community. We are about connection, and it's not about making money out of this. This is what life is about for us. It's a way into life, and the more that we can share that, whether it's online or in person, that's the way that we'd like to take it forward.
Brilliant. Nice. Really nice. Good. So yeah, like I said, with Anthea as well, we'll come back to you both in a bit when people sort of generate some questions and things. I'm going to kind of just bring Jyoti in for a little while as well now. Thank you both.
Thanks.
And so we're looking at resilience. I think we've already spoken. People are talking about the sort of inner dimension of that. There's been mention of the kind of organisation and the group dimensions. I think Eweryst will talk more about the kind of the social movement aspects of that when we talk to Eweryst. But one of the things that we haven't talked about at all is really fundamental levels of resilience. I think it's like Vandana Shiva who said something like our ecological identity is our most fundamental identity, and it's like our resilience really depends on that sort of ecological base, which is like relates to food, land use, all this kind of stuff. And that's just the kind of area that you work in, Jyoti. Your work sort of seems to sort of straddle the relationship between a kind of like this sort of land-based work and kind of creating resilient, sustainable ways of food production and stuff, and the kind of social political transformation as well. Can you maybe tell us a bit about what you're doing with Via Campesina and the Land Workers Alliance?
Yeah, certainly can. And I also struggle juggling technology. Sorry about that. Oh, it's the worst part of it. Oh my God. All the rest is fine. Don't worry about that.
Well, as long as we can all laugh about it, it'll be all right.
Oh God,
Yeah,
no,
good,
seriously.
good.
But anyway, yeah, what do I do? Well, I have a farm in Dorset in south of England, and it's a mixed agroecological farm. Years ago, my husband and I and my kids decided we just wanted to live on the land and live without mains electricity and try and have a low impact lifestyle, because that just appealed to us. We wanted to raise our kids on the land and have fresh food for them. I particularly wanted a job where I could have my kids with me when I was working. to me, it was a really important aspect of it. So I suppose the root of my activism sort of came from there. I wanted my kids to be with me. I didn't want to have to send them into daycare or something while I was doing another job. And yeah, just spend time being in connection with the land. So I guess that's the root of what I do. I work with the Land Workers Alliance because my husband and I found it a real struggle to get onto the land. We had to get land, which is really expensive to get, and we had no money at all. We couldn't even get benefits. We had no recourse to public funds, at the time or anything. So, just trying to get past those sort of barriers. He built us a house and all of that kind of stuff. I realized, we had to learn the skills by going and volunteering on other people's farms, which a lot of people do. We did all of that, and it made us realize that actually, being in connection with land, being on the land is a really important thing if you want to live a sustainable lifestyle, and kind of practice what you're trying to transform the world to be a bit more like. You have to have the ability to do that kind of thing. There wasn't that much to support other people who wanted to do that. And then I kind of worked with other people who were moving back to land and facing the same situation of difficulty of access to land, the difficulty of trying to learn the skills to do it, lots of things going wrong, maybe having to deal with your relationships and your families and things at the same time, and spoke to farmers all around the world who are, like indigenous people, peasant farmers, anywhere you are in the world. Like, it's an incredibly important way to live, being in connection with the land, in terms of environmental sustainability and producing food that works with nature, and that kind of thing. We've got to really transform the world where a lot more people are able to live that way in a dignified way, where it's treated with respect. And actually, the kind of global system makes it very difficult for people to do that. So in the UK, we came together to form the Land Workers Alliance, which is our union for small-scale farmers. Many people who are facing similar situations to ourselves and trying to get access to land and farm, or farmers who are finding it difficult to make a living doing what they're doing, and kind of connected up with other people around the world through La Via Campesina, which is an international peasant farmers movement. We represent 200 million farmers across the world. So it's a huge movement. It's a huge social movement. And that can be indigenous people, fisher people, migrant workers and peasant farmers, who are all kind of facing real structural inequalities in having their voices heard to have access to land and water and resources and things. So, somebody says, was finding an intentional community to live with something you all think about? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, we did live in an intentional community for a while before getting our own farm, for sure. We lived at a place called Tinker's Bubble in South Somerset, which was a fossil fuel-free community. There was about 12 different people living there, some with families, and we didn't have planning permission. So we had to really challenge the fact that you couldn't live on your land and build your own house without planning permission there. So we lived there for a while before we got our own bit of land. And that's also a struggle. I mean, why is it illegal to live a simple life on the land? It's a bit of a crazy idea, really. But yeah, somehow the system has made it very difficult to try and escape the rent trap or all of that, So now I work with the Land Workers Alliance, and we've progressed to form a social movement to try and make that change based on our own experiences of what we've all faced in various ways that have been difficulties in trying to achieve what we want to achieve, which is living on the land and producing food. And I guess that's the root of a social movement. So social movements can be, they're formed of people that have a shared common cause, something that's affected them in their life, and being able to progress in life towards what they want to achieve and come together to fight those injustices, but also to provide solidarity to each other, so that it's not just trying to change policy or fighting big trade agreements or, planning policies or trying to access grants or whatever it is. It's also being there for each other, so you can share the experiences of the difficulties that you've been through, so that you can be a support network for each other. Also sharing and celebrating all the joy of it, how wonderful it is to be harvesting your crops, or go to a really good ceilidh where everybody's really sweaty and dancing together, and just celebrating how fantastic it is. And agricultural communities were always built around that sense of community, that sense of joy, that sense of celebration after a lot of work, and also being there to support each other when things go wrong as well. And so we really form that social movement to work on that. And I think being a part of La Via Campesina means that we can multiply our voices so that we have more impact. We can really share and exchange the strategies that we're using across the different countries. Between 200 million members, there's a lot of experience there as activists working together, where when we share those ideas or come together to really make massive shifts to really, like, we call it massify agroecology, which is this form of farming that we promote, our little actions become bigger than the sum of their parts. It becomes something that can be really transformative. And that's just an incredibly empowering thing, to be a part of that activism. I don't know. At the moment, I'm doing lots of technical stuff. I've been farming for 20 years, and now my kids are older, all 4 of them. After washing 4 kids worth of nappies, I decided, and they got older and everything else, that I would do a little bit more of the politically faced, institutionally faced work, rather than the stuff that was about our own life and how we were going to be transforming our own lives. And so I work a lot on the agricultural policy in the UK. Right now I've been doing a huge campaign around our trade policy, trying to get amendments to the agriculture bill going through Parliament to stop the import of cheap food, and trying to get agroecology into the agriculture bill. And I'm on loads of different committees trying to change policy. And I really enjoy it because it's just a bit by bit kind of process of saying, we've got message and we've got stories and we've got passion. We've got to transmit this into the wider political reality that is we've all been kind of trying from the grassroots to change from the bottom up for so long. How can we actually take that passion we've got on the ground and inspire policymakers to think differently? And I find it fascinating that things are really, a lot of the times things don't really work. The amendment that was debated in Parliament last week, we lost by 50 votes, to stop the import of cheap food. We were trying to get a ban on importing, factory farm chicken and hormone beef and things like that. But then again, you can also look at it, we got 22 Tory rebels to vote for us, which we didn't even expect in the first place, and they're going to start debating in the House of Lords, and lots of people in the public are talking about it, and okay, well, maybe we lost that vote, but we have opened people's minds to the possibility, and we formed a great coalition between, the big industrial farmers unions and every major farming organization and every major environmental organization, signed a joint letter together to try and fight this together. And I thought, well, that coalition is just as important as anything, as the fact that we didn't win that, is that everybody's on the same track, and that's a positive thing. So you've got to kind of think about the small wins of what you're doing as you go through that. And that to me is the empowering thing that keeps me going, doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, so often in the sort of struggles we're involved in, although, as you say, we might not have this particular victories we're working for at that time, the relationships that we build create a kind of, a sort of a resilient kind of source for sort of future power as well, right? So
yeah.
But so I'm interested. One of the things that really interests me, sort of personally, about your practice is in the community where I live. We live on the land, and we have gardens, and there's capacity for like growing and cultivation, fields, and that kind of stuff. But in our community, there's often a real split between people who do work on the land on a day-to-day basis and people who do more of the work I do, which is a bit more kind of socio-politically focused, because it's so hard to kind of integrate that on a sort of day-to-day sort of level, and it can often feel like a real tension within our community at certain times. Historically, there's been a tension, the poke in the office and the people out sort of getting their hands dirty, and that can be hard to integrate. But also, just as an individual, do you find for yourself that you can sort of straddle those different spaces, lobbying members of parliament, building kind of like international alliances, and you're running a farm as well, right? How's that all balance out day to day for you?
Well, I mean, I think different people have different personality types and their ability to juggle things. And I think I'm actually quite good at juggling things. And not everybody is. Some people need to be more focused, with different things. And, you'd have to acknowledge that different people operate differently. And a lot of the people in the Land Workers Alliance, all of our staff, everybody that works, as on, paid salaries in our organization also has to be a working farmer. And that's one of our policies, because we don't want to sort of kind of feed that split between the people, we won't keep our roots on the ground. And I mean, it is possible to try and split up your time. So you spend some time at a computer and some time outside working, and that can actually be really healthy balance. I know there was a community I visited in France. It was called Labore Noble, based on the Gandhian philosophy. And they used to have as part of their work regime that people would spend at least 4 hours doing something, like writing or political activism work, or, something that was more desk-based or intellectually based. They didn't have computers there, so it wasn't on a computer, because they're anti all that kind of technology. But and then the other part of the day doing something physical, so it could be cooking or chopping wood or whatever it is. They used to plow with horses and things like that. And I thought that was a really nice balance, because it is quite good to be able to balance the mind stuff with the physical stuff. And so if you can achieve that, that's brilliant, but it does take a little bit of planning and being careful to set a few boundaries for what you're doing. And if you're not a person that operates like that, I think it's just about helping the people that are around you understand that people work in different ways and have different skill sets, and they can all work together to achieve something very special. That's the power of a social movement. Any social movement, you have your fantastic artists, or you might have your people who are really good at singing songs, or somebody really good at going wow to politicians, or somebody that's good at cooking the meals, and everybody's got a space in it, and you just have to realize that blend is what makes it powerful.
So, I mean, one of the things I found interesting in your story is this, bringing together this kind of, working on the land, sort of relocalization type ethics, this kind of stuff, with the sort of more global, or at least national level kind of political engagement. And often it can feel like there can be a bit of a critical attitude towards people going off and setting up their small holdings, and it's a bit self-interested. It's kind of stepping, it's kind of retreating in a way. It seems that in your case, your re-engagement with the sort of the political level came through necessity, right? Through just coming up against the problems in the system that meant that you couldn't do what you wanted to do. And I mean, is it that your political work is almost like a necessity rather than something that's sort of embedded in terms of the values of what you're doing? Or
I think I think it's about the values as well. I mean, it is a necessity that people fight for wider structural change, I think, in order to really take care of all of humanity a little bit in what everyone does. I feel, to me, that is actually a part of our moral, our moral duty really is to think about everybody across the world while you're doing what you do. But the thing is that it actually brings a lot of power to what you do on a daily level. For a lot of the farmers involved, you might be a peasant farmer, in Africa, working in your fields, but you can have a mobile phone and you can WhatsApp, somebody in India that's saving their seeds, sending pictures of their different color rice, or you can be in your bender about to get evicted from somewhere, and you can somehow communicate that to somebody that's getting evicted off of their land for a mega dam project, and you've got some kind of common thread for what you're working towards, and it means you're working for something that's bigger than yourself. And I think that empowers you a lot. It gives you a wider sense of meaning for what you're doing in your life. It's interesting, what I got most of this from the way I was raised with my mom, really. I mean, she was not a smallholder or a farmer or a food activist in any way, but she was totally blind, and raised 5 of us children as a totally blind woman. She realized that it was very difficult for blind people in America in the 1970s, and founded like a civil rights movement for blind people, trying to work for empowerment of blind people. And, you know, she kind of like started working with other blind people to try and fight for a better system for them, and was very inspired by the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King in the South at the time. We grew up in Louisiana. And you know, I watched her like kind of going around to these meetings, talking to different people, saying, we need to come together. We need to fight for our disability rights. You know, we need to shut down the sheltered workshops that are, you know, doing this. And, you know, kind of dragged us around as kids to the back of all these meetings and to these demonstrations and things like that. And, you know, I just realized, like, you know, being blind was not her problem. It was the society's attitudes towards blind people. And she always said that. And she said, like, you know what, even if somebody gave me my sight back, I wouldn't take it back, because it would have changed, like, what gave me meaning as being part of a movement that really fought for something that was better and bigger than yourself. And, you know, and I can really see now, you know, the tremendous changes in blindness legislation in America, based on, you know, what their work as a social movement really started a long time ago. And you kind of think it's a long-term picture. It's about building up those small things to something that will tremendously change society over time, and like holding on to that. And it's a very powerful thing to realize that you have the ability to change things if you organize and keep the faith and keep going with things.
Brilliant. Thanks. Yeah, when we spoke the other day, I was a bit like, wow, you know, you're doing so much stuff. It's like, and all of them are tough, right? You know, parenting can be tough, and, you know, farming can be hard work, and then this political work that you're doing, it's like such an uphill struggle sometimes. I said, like, how do you keep going with that? You know, what gives you resilience in that? You mentioned this sort of what you're saying now a bit, you know, this bigger picture. You know, when we're doing something that's for something more than for ourselves, there's something that a bigger connection and a solidarity that really sort of sustains you, as you're saying. What do you do? How do you keep that bigger picture there? I mean, you know, it can be hard, right, to not end up kind of for our awareness of the world to shrink down to like our petty concerns and like, shit, you know, this didn't happen, that didn't happen. How do you keep that more expansive kind of connection going? Is there anything particular? Or?
Well, I think once you're a part of a movement, I mean, you get endless WhatsApp, so no, it's hard to stay out. I'm like, come on, go away, actually, sometimes. But yeah, I you know, it's like, you know, once you get stuck in, you know, people just kind of pick up on what you're doing, and you just do it, and then you realize, oh, there's that connection, and there's that connection, and this person's doing that, and, you know, you have to support each other. And I think, you know, as it is that solidarity thing. You realize that bigger picture is there, but you have to kind of you have to balance it with being there for people when things aren't great and things go wrong as well, you know. So it's about developing a sense of family towards even not who's really close, people who aren't just close to you, I guess. I don't know how to put it, really. Yeah, I'm not really sure. Yeah, it's just
I think it comes across, right? The spirit of that comes across, and the way you speak about it. And, I mean, thank you for taking the time to be with us. We'll come back with some questions in a little while. And just looking at the chat, it seems like it was good that you took the time, because there's a lot of people seeming quite inspired. So yeah, nice.
How do you burn out? Oh, I like to go swimming, and I like to eat loads of food. And I like sex.
Great.
Oh, there you go.
Cool. little checklist there. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna bring Eweryst into the conversation in a moment. Just before I do, I need to say we'll talk to Eweryst for about 20 minutes, and then there's going to be these breakout groups. And in the breakout session, you can also just take a break. But if you want to opt into the breakout groups, what you're supposed to do, I think Christopher already said this earlier, but we're reminding you, is use the participant tab on Zoom. There's a little blue hand that gets raised up. Just click that, put your hand up, and then Lindsay, who's going to be organising those groups, will kind of see who wants to be in a group and who doesn't. Okay, so when we get there, you'll know about it. So in the meantime, I'm going to, as I say, bring Eweryst into this. And Eweryst is a member of the Ulex team. Eweryst and I actually live together. We live in a community together. We work together. We're not in the same place today. I don't know when we see Eweryst if you see a very different kind of background. I'm away from home for a few days. But Eweryst is focusing, does a lot of work, but on different areas. But one of the things that Eweryst is leading on is a psychosocial resilience program for LGBTQI plus networks in Central and Eastern Europe. And Eweryst, if he was telling you, they were telling you this, would also say Western Balkans and post-Soviet countries, but it becomes a bit of a mouthful, right? So, and it's work that came out of Ulex. We often do sort of strategic kind of thinking. We did a context analysis a couple of years ago. A couple of big issues that came to the surface where we wanted to put energy was one being climate justice movement, and another being the sort of the rise of the far right, autocratic, authoritarian, nationalist, populist regimes in Eastern Europe. And so we started putting energy into that, and within that, it's very clear that the LGBTQI networks and communities are really at the brunt of the kind of repressive systems there. There have been the use of sort of demonizing people in those communities by the Law and Justice Party in their election program in October last year in Poland. In Hungary, just a week ago, there was a new law being passed which makes it impossible to change your gender in law, and so on. So, you know, we kind of began focusing on that, and Eweryst is taking the lead on that, and they're doing a great job of it as well. So I'm sort of wondering, Eweryst, you tell us a bit about how did you get into doing that kind of work?
Sure, yeah, thank you, G. And I just need to say that it's just also really inspiring to just listen to other speakers. And I think part of my journey into this kind of work was through inspiration of just like, yeah, seeing other people doing really, really great job. But before the inspiration part came, I think I mostly started with a lot of disillusionment and like, yeah, losing hope. So my background is in like grassroots anarchist organizing, and this kind of organizing left me with a lot of feeling of lack, and yeah, previous speakers were mentioning those things as well, but it's like lack of real deep connection and lack of prefiguration that Anthea was talking about, and I've noticed myself like emotionally shutting down and experiencing loads of lack of hope, and I was just sick and tired of proving myself by doing and putting myself on the front line. And yeah, what Aesha and Dean said as well about like the quality of relating to each other, like, really lacking that quality and really lacking questions around how do we relate to each other. And in the same time, I was getting loads and loads of energy and motivation from sense of belonging to a community, sense of joy and celebration. So what Jyoti was mentioning, this sense of like, oh, we are doing this thing together, we are in it together. And I got like loads of inspiration as well as I've later on entered feminist movement and the emphasis of community care, and self-preservation and things like that. That was really inspiring, and I started seeing things happening around me. So there was early stages of activist trauma support, and people starting to talk about like, oh, actually this work that we are doing does have an emotional influence on us, and it does matter. So it was just seeing those different movement groups emerging. I was getting really inspired by them. I went on a sustaining resistance training in Ecodam, one of the very first ones, and that was a great inspiration for me as well. So a possibility for me to explore my own lack of hope, my own process of burning out and losing motivation. And then I've joined a trainers collective, grassroots social movements trainers collective called Spina, which was and still is based in Poland. We are 4 people, and we started doing this kind of work in Poland, looking at, okay, so how do we work as groups, how we relate to each other, what are our processes, how are we doing in this prefiguration of our values, and also looking at the topic of burnout, losing hope, losing members of our communities. And that was quite a battle, to be honest, in the beginning, to like even bring those topics into the awareness of social movements. But it was well worth it. And and then I also had a continuous relationship with Ecodharma and Ulex project, and here I am now at the Ulex project.
So, I mean, recently in developing the LGBTQI plus resilience project, you've been doing quite a bit of sort of work on the ground, kind of talking to a lot of people, a lot of needs assessment type work as well. You're well connected into a lot of networks there yourself anyway. For people who maybe aren't, don't have a very clear sense of what is going on, what are the experiences for LGBTQI plus folk in Central and Eastern Europe at the moment? What's that feeling like?
So you mentioned the rise of far right and national populism, and all those discourses and different totalitarian regimes coming to power in Hungary, Poland, and general tendency of the rise of far right across the whole region. And when I was talking with different groups and organizations from the region, it was really striking to hear how this experience is very similar for a lot of people, a lot of groups, a lot of movements. And I think there are different factors to it. So one factor is the broad similar socio-political situation across the whole region, which got to do with like historical factors, the shared experience of being part of a Soviet bloc, which creates certain cultural, political tissue, certain way of building society. And obviously, like the countries in the region were undergoing the transition out of the Soviet bloc in many different ways, and the process doesn't look the same in the whole region, but there are really big similarities coming from that. And then also the rise of far right and that tendency spreading across the region, and how this tendency is really affecting LGBTQI movement, and how LGBTQI movement is becoming one of the main targets of the rising far right movement, and also how the LGBTQI activism is different to the LGBTQI activism in Western Europe. Because of those like different sociopolitical contexts, but also low culture. And so like to just give some examples, like there seems to be certain narrative that the far right movement is using to attack the LGBTQI movements and communities, and they are talking about like Western gender ideology, and how like LGBTQI communities are threatening family values, and like endangering traditional national values and things like that. And those kind of narratives used by the politicians are really, really similar across the whole region. And it's curious because like those kind of narratives are quite, in some places, quite connected with religious extremism and Catholicism, but not the Catholic Church is not so strong in all of the countries across the region. So it's quite curious that like it's kind of the same kind of narrative in the region. So yeah, there is like really a lot of transphobia, homophobia in the region. There's lack of social acceptance. There's in a lot of countries there's poor legislation in terms of like protecting LGBTI community, and there is also a poor level of implementation of the anti-discriminatory laws. So there might be laws that are there written, but like the level of implementation is not really working. So recently I was speaking with one of the really big umbrella organizations working in Western Balkans. They did a survey across Western Balkans, and 82% of LGBTQI citizens that took part in that survey consider that Serbia is not a good place to live as an LGBTQI person, and this is one statistic from Serbia, but it's really similar across the whole region. There is also very low trust in the government and politicians among the LGBTQI community. So these are all like statistics and political context, but also it's got a very real effect on lives of LGBTQI people, but also specifically LGBTQI activists in the region. So the LGBTQI community is already a vulnerable group that, as I mentioned, not really protected by the laws, under a lot of stress, attack, and a lot of very harsh narratives coming from the society. And then because of the socio-political situation, people who are LGBTQI activists are experiencing a lot of economical precarity in many ways. So NGOs that work around LGBTQI issues, but also broader anti-discriminatory issues, do not have access to funding because in many countries the funding is not there for this kind of work because of how the funding is being distributed by the government, or many organizations are not deciding to apply for governmental money because it just puts them on the spot and creates a great risk of repression. And it might be really covert, sneaky kind of repression of like, as soon as you receive governmental money, you receive more searches, more desk checks. The authorities will question your taxes, your the way you keep your bookings and stuff like that. And that's a very that's a very particular kind of repression that like a lot of organizations are afraid of in the region.
So what is it that the program that you're developing and running? What kind of learning is there in that, and how are you hoping it will help organizations and people and the movement to build resilience there?
Yeah, so there are different levels to it as well. I think the main thing that I'm really passionate about is actually building a movement that will be a strong movement across that region. Because I was really inspired about what Jyoti was talking about, because what I believe in, that like this kind of powers, this kind of repression is really seeking out to alienate us, so alienate LGBTQI community from wider community, but also to alienate LGBTQI activists, LGBTQI community members from each other. And what we need to do, and like the biggest act of fighting against that power is to come together and reach out to each other. So the elements of the program will enable people to come together and share knowledge from different types of organizing, but also from different types of security strategies, resilience strategies that different organizations and movements are implementing across the region. The program will also explore the topic of security and risk management. So it's quite crucial in this situation that movements, organizations are being prepared for the level of oppression and identifying elements of hostile environments, identifying the levels of risk and possible strategies to answer and adapt to those risks is really, really crucial for the longevity of the movement. And then also we will talk about burnout and burnout prevention. So earlier when I was talking about the trainers collective and that we set up in Poland, Spina, what we saw back then in Poland is that the level of burnout across the movements was really, really big, but the knowledge about what burnout actually is was really, really small, and that's what's still happening in a lot of places in Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, across the movement. And that's something that a lot of organizations were talking to me that, yeah, we this is a huge problem, but we never talk about it. So the idea is to just actually bring that topic on the table and see how, okay, so it's there. What do we need to do about it? And also, yeah, just relationship building. So being able to bring people together so that they share their experiences, share their struggles, and like similar how what Jyoti said, that's something that gives us strength. That's something that make us feel there is this bigger picture. There's a lot of us actually, and we come up against similar obstacles, and we can work together to overcome them.
Thanks, Eweryst. I mean, I know that you personally, you've put quite a lot of time as well into developing skills and understanding around working somatically with trauma and this kind of approach as well. Is that something that you will bring into the program also?
Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna, on part of the programs, I'm gonna work with another trainer who's also really into somatic methodologies, and yeah, again, that's something that's not really well explored across the movements. And for me personally, that's a really strong source of my own resilience, my own connection to my body. And as a trans person, for me, that was a really huge journey to be able to reclaim that connection and to be in connection with my own body. And that's why it's so powerful. So in the context of working with the LGBTQI movement, when it is our bodies that we are fighting for yeah, in many cases, this work seems to be really, really crucial.
Brilliant. Thanks, Eweryst. Thank you. So we're actually gonna go into this break now, a 20-minute break. So we've got a few questions here that came up, and I'll ask them to each of you individually, but I mean, you can all kind of chip in to these if they sort of resonate for you. And the first question I was going to put to you, Anthea. I mean, it seems like an age ago since we heard from you. So this is this first one, and it relates to a theme of activist identity, and the sense that within the term activist, there are quite different kind of constituencies. There are people who are activists in the sense of maybe they're kind of professionals working with NGOs. Sometimes they kind of like could be seen as like activists by choice. You know, we sort of have a calling and go and do that. But then there are other people who maybe not call themselves activists, but they're very much doing activist work, maybe grassroots, community-based kind of organizing, where activism grows out of the kind of the necessity of everyday life. And there can be tensions between these different kinds of identities within activism. Is that, you sort of say something, tell us something about that and your experience of navigating some of those differences?
Yeah, so I had an interesting experience when I first started asking people questions about what the, what do you think the inner life of activism, what's going on in the inner life of activism? Does that mean anything to you? What do you think's missing, if anything? Because there were broadly two different types of answers, and of course there was variation between them. And one was when I spoke to people who'd been doing a similar kind of activism to me, which is essentially choosing to do it, because for whatever reason you're not having to fight for the very conditions of your existence, the dailiness of that struggle, but you're choosing to do this, and all the people I spoke to about that from that perspective said, well, yes, you're right, definitely something's missing, and they saw it in very similar terms to how I saw it. And then when I spoke to people who, in whatever way, had been fighting for their lives effectively, or at least with lived experience of what it was, they said, well, yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. Of course something's missing. Of course we need to look at this. But hold on, this isn't new. We've always known this. That's the very basis of the kind of activism we're doing. We have to do that work ourselves in order to get to the point where we can do activism. Of course we know this. Like, that is half the problem. We can see it. And it's that people who are on the outside of the conditions of privilege for whatever that particular issue is, of course can see the problems with the dominant system much more clearly than those who are caught up in the privilege of acting within it. And this comes right down to the tension that can be at the heart of a lot of activist difficulties, and the saviour stuff that can go on. So I think our understanding of the inner work, and what it is, can be really quite cloudy and quite blocked by various forms of privilege, and that's certainly an understanding that I came to through going into this inquiry. I kind of thought I got it. I thought I understood the nature of my privilege and what it had got me into, and what therefore I was bringing to my activism. But actually, there were things that I hadn't understood. I hadn't understood the depth of how where any of us come from conditions how we know things, and the situations that we can then get into in activism. And I think quite a lot of I talk at the end of what I'm writing about what we might need to reclaim and what we might need to relinquish. And I think this work is so much better thought through by people who have got lived experience of what they're working on, which is not to say, of course, that like everyone's got work to do up to a point, but I think people who are living it have had to do some of that work. And I think people who are choosing to come in and put their weight behind a struggle might have more to relinquish than they realise when they get into this.
Thanks. And there's a related question for Jyoti, which relates to the way I'm interpreting the question is some of those differences show up really clearly in the kind of global movement and that you're involved in, sort of land rights and different kinds of ways of organising, different kinds of experience. How do you work with that kind of diversity within the global movement, the sort of via campesina type work that you're doing? How do you work with the diversity of constituencies that make that up?
Yeah, that's actually really, it's hard work sometimes. And we spend an awful lot of time doing very boring, long meetings where you have to have translation for everything, because translation's core to the work, because so many of the peasant farming communities, indigenous communities around the world, the multiplicity of languages is just unbelievable, and it will really marginalize voices unless we do that. So every meeting has to have a whole layer of translators involved and speaking orders, and man, women, and youth being have you ever been involved in any meetings, where you have to do consensus decision making? Imagine, with 200 million members trying to get consensus decisions. It's a bit mad at the gatherings, and the meetings go on for like 18 hours. And we have a saying: it's not another world is possible; it's another meeting is possible.